All right, so are you ready to dive into the entire history of the U.S.?
From Paleo-Indians to practically present day, let's do it.
We're using excerpts from, believe it or not, Wikipedia's History of the United States article.
Which is, I have to say, surprisingly detailed.
It's remarkable, so get ready to have your mind blown as we uncover some hidden connections and forgotten stories.
You know, when you say forgotten stories, it makes me think about how so often we picture pre-colonial America as this, like, pristine wilderness.
Untouched, totally wild.
Right. But say, like, 10,000 years ago, it's a
Yeah.
totally different world.
Okay, so paint me a picture. What did it actually look like?
So picture this. Giant mammoths and mastodons roaming around, landscapes still kind of bouncing back from the last ice age.
Wow.
And the Paleo-Indians, the earliest Americans,
Yeah.
adapting to this environment that was constantly changing.
So they had to be pretty resourceful, right?
Exactly, yeah. And they were really on the cusp of a huge change, which was agriculture.
Mm.
So down in Mesoamerica, people were already cultivating corn and beans and squash.
The Three Sisters.
Right, and that knowledge, it gradually spread north. And by like 3000 BCE, farming was starting to take root in the Southwest.
So we're talking irrigation, permanent villages.
Precisely.
Wow. So agriculture in what we now call the U.S. predates European arrival by literally thousands of years.
It really does.
It kind of blows a hole in that whole narrative that Europeans brought civilization, doesn't it?
It definitely challenges that assumption, yeah. And it gets really interesting because one of the most incredible examples of early cities in North America was Cahokia.
Cahokia, okay.
This city was near present-day St. Louis, and between 800 and 1400 CE, Cahokia, it was thriving. It had a population of about 20,000 people, which is actually larger than London was at that time.
Wait, hold on. A city in the U.S. that was bigger than London.
Yeah.
You're blowing my mind right now. I need to hear more about this.
It wasn't just big, it was a sophisticated society, right?
Yeah.
They had social hierarchies, trade networks that stretched from the Great Lakes all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico.
Wow.
And then, of course, there are those incredible earthen mounds.
Oh, right, yeah.
Even today, Monk's Mound, it's over 100 feet tall.
It's incredible to think about these early societies building these huge structures, managing all these resources, creating these intricate trade networks across such vast distances. Like, they really had a deep understanding of their world and their influence. I mean, it lasted for centuries.
It did.
But what happened? Why don't we hear more about them? It's like they just disappeared.
That's a question that kind of leads us right into the next chapter of U.S. history, which is the arrival of Europeans.
Right, right.
And while I think we all know about, Columbus and the Mayflower, the full impact of European colonization, it's a lot more complicated and, to be honest, often a much more tragic story.
Okay, so let's get into that. I mean, we've all heard the basic story, but what are some things about the colonial experience that maybe we didn't learn in school?
Well, for starters, you've got those 13 colonies, right?
That eventually become the U.S.
Right, but they weren't this unified group.
Each one doing their own thing.
Exactly. Each one had its own distinct character, shaped by the people who settled there, the environment, the economic opportunities.
So it's more like 13 separate experiments in building a nation, not one cohesive effort.
That's a really good way to put it.
Interesting.
So, for instance, take New Netherland,
Okay, New Netherlands.
founded in the early 1600s by the Dutch.
Oh, okay.
Now, this one was surprisingly diverse for its time. They welcomed people of all different faiths, including Jewish settlers, Huguenots, who were fleeing Europe.
Wow, that's pretty progressive for the time.
Very much so. And they built relationships with the Iroquois Confederacy.
Oh, wow.
And get this, they even bought Manhattan from the Native Americans.
You've got to be kidding. For like, what, a handful of beads?
Well, a few goods,
you guys.
the steal, some might say.
Yeah, steal.
But, when you think about colonial America, it's not exactly the image that usually comes to mind.
Not at all. Like when I think colonial America, I'm picturing those buckle hats and the pilgrims. It's not
Exactly.
this kind of bustling, diverse port city.
And it wasn't just the Dutch.
Oh, really?
There's this whole other lesser-known chapter involving New Sweden.
New Sweden, all right.
Yeah, it was a colony in the Delaware Valley around the mid-1600s.
Okay.
It didn't last super long, but its legacy lived on through things like log cabin construction and agricultural innovations that actually influenced later settlers.
So we're talking about a lot of different influences shaping the colonies. More than you might think, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. And the differences between the northern and southern colonies, they were even more dramatic.
Okay. In what ways?
So you've got the North, right? They developed smaller farms focused on things like commerce and trade, and a more egalitarian social structure started to emerge.
Okay, makes sense.
But then you've got the South, which went in a totally different direction. They developed this whole plantation economy built on cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo, all of it heavily reliant on enslaved labor.
Right, right.
And it's that difference, that fundamental difference in their economies and social values that really planted the seeds for the Civil War.
Right, because it created two very different versions of what America was supposed to be. And those divisions, it's like they still echo today in a lot of ways.
100%.
It's fascinating to see how these early choices, the different cultures, the economies, even like the architectural styles, they all left their mark on the country. It's like you can trace those historical threads through the modern U.S.
You really can.
But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we haven't even gotten to the Civil War yet. Let's rewind a bit. What were some of those major events that led up to the American Revolution?
Well, the French and Indian War ended in 1763,
Okay.
and Britain was deep in debt after all that fighting. So they decided to tighten their grip on the colonies to try to recover financially.
Right, they needed to refill the coffers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They imposed all these new taxes on the colonists, things like the Stamp Act, without giving them any representation in Parliament.
Which, as you can imagine, didn't go over well.
Not at all. No taxation without representation.
Right.
And this sparked protests and boycotts all throughout the colonies. And it was during this time that figures like Benjamin Franklin,
Ah, good old Ben Franklin.
he really became instrumental in giving the colonists a voice and promoting the idea of like a united nation.
And wasn't he also the one who created that famous Join or Die cartoon?
That's the one. He published it during the French and Indian War, actually, advocating for the colonies to band together against common threats.
It's wild to think that these events, though centuries removed, were driven by a lot of the same things that people still care about today.
Yeah.
Fairness, representation, just having a say in your own destiny.
Absolutely.
It really makes you think about how we're not so different from those who came before us.
It's the cyclical nature of history.
Exactly. And the fight for freedom and self-governance, those are themes that have echoed throughout history.
They really have.
It wasn't a sure thing, the American Revolution.
Not at all.
It was a hard-fought battle. But those ideals of liberty and self-governance, they fueled the colonists to ultimately win their independence and establish this brand new nation.
Incredible.
Founded on principles that, you're right, have reverberated around the world. But as with any new nation, the story doesn't end there. There were growing pains, challenges to overcome.
Oh, absolutely. And some big ones, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, like figuring out how to actually govern this new nation they had just created.
Right, because it wasn't just about declaring independence, it was about building something that would actually last.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And their first attempt, the Articles of Confederation, well,
It didn't go so well, did it?
not really. Kind of created this like really loose alliance of states.
More like a league of friendship, right? That's what I've always heard it called.
Yeah, it didn't give the federal government a whole lot of power.
Not a lot of authority to work with.
No, not really. They could barely tax. They couldn't really regulate commerce. And enforcing any kind of national policy was a nightmare.
So basically, it was doomed to fail.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It quickly became clear that they needed a different approach, something more, I don't know, robust.
Something that could tie the states together more effectively.
Exactly. And that's where the Constitutional Convention comes in, 1787.
Yes. The birth of the Constitution.
A big one.
The document that's been like the foundation of U.S. governance for centuries.
And it's pretty incredible when you think about it, how they managed to create this system of checks and balances.
With power divided between the federal government and the state government.
Right. And at the same time, they outlined these fundamental rights for citizens.
It was a pretty groundbreaking document for its time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But even with the Constitution, there were still some big issues that they just couldn't ignore, most notably the whole issue of slavery.
Yeah, that's the elephant in the room, isn't it?
Definitely. It was this huge point of contention.
Right.
Because you have this document that's supposed to be about freedom and equality, but at the same time, it allows for the continuation of slavery.
It's like this huge contradiction at the heart of the nation's founding.
It really is. And it had major consequences down the line. It's something they struggled with for decades.
It's a dark side of U.S. history that we can't ever forget, even as we celebrate the achievements.
Absolutely.